Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'm going to be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, I was taken aback by some news you shared with me a few days ago that you caught COVID for the third time, which seems totally unfair. People don't catch COVID 3 times, it seems. Not in any just universe, not in a universe where God loves us. So I hope you're getting better, but what were your first thoughts when you got that diagnosis?
My first thought is the third time's the charm.
Yeah, you're finally getting it right this time.
Yeah, I'm over it now, except for a tiny residual cough. It was basically a glorified head cold for a few days. And that's kind of what I expected. But just to your earlier point about it's unjust for me to get it 3 times, I read in my local paper that experts think about 20% of the population of New York City has had COVID 3 times or more by now.
Wow. That's incredible. When we were first in the grips of this thing, and people were talking about COVID as like this almost an extinction level event, it was unimaginable that you could catch it twice because you might die from it the first time. And so it's kind of remarkable that in some areas we're transitioning into where it's just kind of a super flu.
Endemic. Yep. Something we'll get vaccinated for when we get our flu vaccine every year, probably.
Yeah. You probably resent the fact that I've never caught COVID and neither has my wife.
No, I don't resent it at all, but I am astonished because you live in an urban area.
Yeah.
You would think that you would have gotten it at least once by now.
Yeah. Well, we keep to ourselves. We're homebodies.
Obviously.
Homebodies and not particularly friendly, which turns out to be quite an asset in this sort of situation.
Yes.
Okay, well, there is a bit of a segue here because we're segueing to a scientific topic, and one such topic would be vaccinations and vaccine research. I was caught by this headline that came across, which is that Stanford University president voluntarily stepped down because it turns out that a lab that he had been in control of was pursuing questionable research and publishing papers that had garbage data in it. And it really made me remember the number of headlines I've seen recently about just really bad science and papers being retracted and things being pulled back and results not being reproducible. And it struck me that no one's really talking about this at the aggregate level about what all of this means, where we live in a society where we're supposed to trust in scientific research, and yet it seems like a lot of that research is kind of garbage. And so I sent you off with a question. How bad is this problem? Is it just an embarrassment for science and scientific institutions? Or should we actually be concerned that, according to some studies, nearly 50% of all scientific research is actually not very scientific? So what did you find?
Well, thanks for the question. And I saw those same headlines you did, but I didn't pay particular attention to them. So this question gave me the opportunity to dig deeper. And I hope I've come up with an answer that pretty much reflects the reality of the situation. It's kind of a mixed verdict.
Yeah.
Anyway, this topic is obviously no laughing matter, but I got to tell you right up front that when I first read the story about how the Harvard Business School behavioral scientist Francesca Gino faked the results of a 2012 study about how to elicit honest behavior, I laughed out loud.
Yeah, that was just beautiful irony. I enjoyed that one too.
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned the resignation of the Stanford president in your question, so let's start there. Mark Tessier-Levine announced in July that he will step down at the end of this month as president of Stanford after an outside panel of scientists commissioned by the school criticized his oversight and management of his laboratory. The same panel exonerated him of fraud and data manipulation. Tessier-Levine, who's a prominent neuroscientist, is the author of more than 220 scientific papers, primarily on the causes and treatment of degenerative brain disorders like Alzheimer's disease. Apparently, Employees at Tessier-Levine's lab had manipulated data in at least a dozen published papers dating back to 1999, long before he became Stanford's president in 2016. These studies were published in high-profile journals like Nature and Science. It doesn't get much bigger than those two.
Right.
Although the panel found that Tessier-Levine didn't falsify data himself or even know about the misconduct at the time the research was published, he didn't act decisively and forthrightly to respond to the allegations of data improprieties or to correct the scientific record. And as a result, the panel's report concluded that his lab's work had multiple problems and, quote, fell below customary standards of scientific rigor and process, end quote.
And Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but a number of these papers, he was listed as the primary author on the paper.
That's correct.
So in exonerating him of knowledge of the wrongdoing, they were basically saying he presented this as his work, and yet it wasn't actually his work, which I find questionable in itself.
Yes, and I'm going to talk a little later about what the implications of that are, but that's correct. He's the co-author of many articles, but he's also the primary author of a lot of these papers. The report criticized Tessier-Levine for creating a lab culture that generated data improprieties at an unusual frequency. Though he was held in high regard by several former postdoctoral fellows, some described a pressure cooker environment and a lab culture that rewarded quote-unquote winners, defined as researchers who generated favorable results, while diminishing or marginalizing those who didn't.
Those are some pretty perverse incentives, are there?
Yeah, and we're going to talk a lot about that too in today's episode, Mark. One of the consequences of the report is that Tessier-Levine is expected to request corrections to or retractions of some of the papers in question. Though he's giving up Stanford's presidency, he will remain there as a tenured professor of biology. The accusations against Tessier-Levine started with an anonymous comment posted in 2015 to PubPeer, an online forum for discussion of published scientific work. They resurfaced after the student newspaper, the Stanford Daily, published a series of articles questioning the work produced in laboratories overseen by Tessier-Levine, and published in papers listing him as principal author or co-author. I find it interesting that many of the details reviewed by the Stanford panel were brought forward by dogged investigative reporters working for the school newspaper.
And the primary reporter on that was a freshman, was he not?
That's right.
What a flex.
Yes.
In your freshman year in Stanford to take on the president and win.
Yes. The panel did rebut the newspaper's most inflammatory claims that Tessier-Levine tried to cover up fraud committed by his lab. But the Stanford Daily stands by its reporting and claims that some of their sources refused to participate in the university's formal investigation when they were not guaranteed anonymity. I'm going to have more to say later about your main question of whether we should be concerned that published scientific data might not be scientific at all. But for now, I want to point out that the scientific method is founded on testing your hypothesis by gathering data through experimentation, analyzing the results to see if the hypothesis holds up, then publishing your results in a peer-reviewed journal, whereupon other academics try to confirm your hypothesis by replicating your experimental results. When published studies can't be replicated, it's impossible for a scientific consensus to form around that data. In other words, the scandal here is not that bad data is being accepted as good by the scientific mainstream. It's more that bad data, some of it so bad that it was detectable, as you said, by a college freshman in the school newspaper, is being published in such journals in the first place.
Yeah.
How is that happening? And why are these journals so slow to act on allegations of data fraud? Reputable newspapers have high standards for the information they publish, and when that information is incorrect, a written retraction is customary. Is the same true of scientific journals? In theory, yes. But as the Cub reporter who broke this story, Theo Baker of the Stanford Daily, wrote in an opinion piece for the New York Times, quote, peer review, a process designed to ensure the quality of studies before publication, is based on a foundation of honesty between author and reviewer. That process has often failed to catch brazen image manipulation. And when concerns are raised after the fact, as they were in this case, they often fail to gain public attention or prompt correction of the scientific record. End quote. One of the academics who identified problems in Tessier-Levine's research was Matthew Schrag, an assistant professor of neurology at Vanderbilt University. Schrag told the New York Times that the publication of flawed studies by scientific journals illustrates how they sometimes give the benefit of the doubt to prominent researchers without fully vetting their studies. It's difficult for senior scientists like Tessier-Levine, who are running busy labs, to scrutinize all the data produced by the junior researchers they supervise. Schrag said, quote, I have some mixed feelings about the heat that he's taking because I think that it's extremely unlikely he was the key player at fault here. I think he had a responsibility to do more probably than he did, but that doesn't mean he wasn't trying to do the right thing, end quote. Even so, Schrag added, quote, I think the accumulation of problems does rise to a level that needs some oversight, end quote.
Yeah. I would agree that some oversight is called for.
Yeah, probably a euphemism. Veteran researchers asked about this situation stress how important it is for lab leaders like Tessier-Levine to communicate to their trainees that hypotheses are often wrong and experiments don't always come out the way you expect them to. Instead of seeing that as a failure, researchers should arguably celebrate when that occurs because unexpected results can open doors to other discoveries. If problems occur, it's important for lab leaders to act decisively to notify journals and take responsibility for errors.
Yeah.
According to Kim Barrett, the Vice Dean of Research at the University of California, Davis School of Medicine, correcting the scientific record is far from a, quote, badge of shame. It's part of the way that science is supposed to work, end quote. Barrett claims that sometimes labs and the journals that publish their work lack what she calls an appropriate appetite for making corrections, which inhibits the self-correcting nature of scientific exploration. When papers with falsified data aren't corrected or retracted promptly, the consequences to the research community can be enormous. Tessier-Levine's many problematic papers were cited thousands of times in subsequent papers, meaning that other scientists spent precious resources and time following up on what was essentially bad information.
Yeah. Bad science leads to more bad science.
Yes. Another issue is that multitasking lab leaders might be biting off more than they can chew. Tessier-Levine's resignation reinvigorated a long-running conversation about lab oversight policies and the responsibilities of principal investigators like him. While Tessier-Levine was running the lab, he also held high-profile positions as president of the Rockefeller University in New York City and as head of research at the biotech company Genentech in San Francisco. Some observers of his situation have questioned the feasibility of simultaneously holding administrative positions and running a lab, with all the oversight responsibility that entails, asserting that both roles are full-time positions, and universities like Stanford should reconsider hiring researchers like Tessier-Levine unless they agree to step back from their research gigs.
Right.
That said, many researchers take on administrative roles while running their labs, and in most cases they aren't accused of misconduct. What the Tessier-Levine situation underscores, say some observers, is the need for senior or principal investigators to be present in their labs and regularly reviewing data with their teams while also maintaining a robust and reviewable paper trail. It's also worth noting that the people who run labs, while often brilliant scientists, are not always good at training and managing people, which requires a completely different skill set.
You spoke earlier to sort of the culture of the lab, that positive results were celebrated and negative results, like you were a loser, you were a winner if you got the results that he was looking for.
Yes.
I would think that at least can be placed at his feet, that he is responsible for the culture of his lab. Because if it's not him, who else is it? Who else would have produced that culture?
Sure.
And so that he was too busy to take care of his own lab, that certainly doesn't exonerate him. If anything, his primary responsibility is the research coming out of his lab, and all of those other responsibilities should have come second, and it doesn't sound like they did.
I agree completely with you on that. My sense from my reading in preparation for this episode is that the lab leaders are such exalted figures and they're so high in the food chain that they have this kind of built-in plausible deniability if things go awry. But in terms of setting the cultural tone of the lab, of course, it all flows from the top, and he is completely responsible for that. And any lab leader is responsible, I think.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No junior researcher got into science with the hope of falsifying evidence.
That's right.
Particularly because you're junior, because you don't have tenure to fall back on. If you get caught in that, your career is over. So you're only going to do that if it's very clear what the incentives are and that you need to get positive results. And that would come from someone like Tessier-Levine.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so that's the story of the former Stanford president, but you wouldn't have asked me about this issue, Mark, if his resignation was the only example of faulty lab research.
Yeah.
As you pointed out in your opening, there's been a rash of stories like this in the media lately, including the one I made light of at the top, which happened just this past June. There's another one in the world of nutrition research in the fall of 2018 that I want to talk about now. In that one, Brian Wansink resigned from his post at Cornell University following an internal investigation of his scientific misconduct that resulted in the retraction of 18 of his papers,
wow,
the correction of 15 papers, and 7 others receiving expressions of concern. Wansink had served as director of Cornell's Food and Brand Lab before being removed from all his research and teaching duties. Prior to working at Cornell, he was the executive director of the USDA's Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. Those are the folks responsible for the famous food pyramid. According to an NPR story, Wansink, quote, made a name for himself producing pithy, palatable studies that connected people's eating habits with cues from their environment, end quote. His work focused on how easy it is to manipulate people's food choices and quantities for better or worse. Among his findings, a lot of which you may recognize from reading them in the newspaper, were that people consumed more calories watching action movies than interview shows, or those enormous buckets of popcorn you get at movie theaters make people eat more. Duh.
Of course, yeah.
And the closer people sit to the buffet at an all-you-can-eat restaurant, the more they eat. One of his most famous studies, the Bottomless Bowls study, concluded that eating was less about satisfying hunger than about completing the task of emptying a bowl. The message being that people should take smaller portions and use smaller bowls. As The Atlantic put it, Wansink, quote, was integral in leading the narrative that obesity and diabetes have less to do with individual willpower or flawed personhood than with psychological manipulation by a food industry that wants to sell as many cheap calories as possible, end quote. Cornell's summary of its investigation stated that Wansink's misconduct included, quote, data falsification and misreporting of research data, problematic statistical techniques, failure to properly document and preserve research results, and inappropriate authorship, end quote. After his resignation, Wansink acknowledged in emails to BuzzFeed that his published work had some problems, but maintained that, quote, there was no fraud, no intentional misreporting, no plagiarism, and no misappropriation, end quote.
So he was falling back on the I'm a bad scientist defense?
I'm not sure he would agree to that. I think he's basically acknowledging mistakes were made, but they were not nefarious mistakes. That's the way I read it.
Okay.
Anyway, I was curious about what came of this guy Wansink after the unraveling of his career. He has a personal website in which he describes himself as a pracademic, which he defines as, quote, an academic who has a practical mission to help change behavior and improve people's lives, end quote. He's still dispensing advice on how to make healthy eating easier. And for what it's worth, I think he clearly means well. And I'm going to link to his website on our Facebook page in case you or our listeners want to take a look. Now, Mark, did you ever hear the term p-hacking before?
I have heard of that, yes. It refers to the tendency when dealing with statistical results to manipulate what you're working with in order to get a result that appears to be statistically significant, but is actually not that significant.
Yes, exactly right. And I should have known you would know the answer to that. So as you said, I put it in my own words, it means massaging ambiguous data to find positive results. And by positive results, I mean stuff that's more interesting and publication friendly than the clinical data would otherwise indicate. This p-hacking rises to misconduct when the manipulation or cherry picking of data yields results that look scientifically significant but aren't. Large data sets are particularly prone to p-hacking. Here's an example I think anybody can understand. It involves the simple coin flip. Let's say you ran an experiment where you flipped a coin 1,000,000 times. At some point in that process, you're likely to get 10 heads in a row. That doesn't mean your methodology is faulty. It's just a snapshot of random chance in a tiny sample size of a much larger data set. But if you extract that sliver of data and ignore the rest, you can make that random result look like it's not due to chance, as if the coin were weighted to fall on heads.
Yeah.
P-hacking is what got Brian Wansink fired. It was verified by independent researchers like Tim van der Zee, a doctoral student in educational psychology at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and then confirmed by Cornell's investigation. A trove of internal emails obtained by BuzzFeed News from various records requests showed Wansink encouraging his students to sift through the reams of data they kept on their various experiments to find results that would, quote, go virally big time, end quote.
Yeah.
Indeed, the emails showed that Wansink's students conducted dozens of failed analyses that never got published before arriving at the headline-grabbing findings that were picked up by national media and made him an academic star.
Right. Which is one of the ways that nutrition science is different from like immunology or another discipline, in that headlines are generated by nutrition science.
Yes.
If you come up with a study that says you can lower your cholesterol by eating dark chocolate, the New York Times will report on that because people love that sort of thing.
Right.
And it influences the way that people behave. Whereas if you're researching in, geological sciences and also conducting p-hacking, it doesn't have nearly as many waves just because so few people are paying attention.
Yes, unless you found a large deposit of dark chocolate buried underneath the rocks. That might make the news.
That is the dream, yes.
But yeah, point well taken. Andrew Althouse, a statistician at the University of Pittsburgh who closely monitored the controversy around Wansink's research methods, told NPR that, quote, this should be the cautionary tale that gets brought up in Research Methods 101 across a number of disciplines, end quote. I think it's easy to beat up on Wansink after the fact, but as with Tessier-Levine, he was operating within a framework that perhaps requires some rethinking. As Tim van der Zee put it to NPR, quote, science has become faster than is healthy, end quote. Cornell agrees with that sentiment. Their VP of University Relations told NPR that researchers and their universities can become tempted to race for the next attention-grabbing headline, quote, as the pace and reach of news has become instant and global, end quote. Even so, Cornell believes that the overwhelming majority of scientists are committed to rigorous and transparent work of the highest caliber. But is that claim true? Judge for yourself. And I looked for metrics about this. This is what I could find, Mark. Separate studies have estimated the rate of fake data in published papers to be about 2%, and the rate of inappropriately manipulated images to be about 3.8%. While that suggests that an overwhelming majority of researchers are not fudging their data, given the way papers are constantly recited by other researchers, it seems to me that a 2 to 4% rate of bad data can do an awful lot of damage.
Yeah.
And consider this stat. Only 0.04% of published studies are retracted. That gap between bad data and retractions shows a lack of accountability among both researchers and the journals in which they publish. It reflects a scientific culture in which admitting failures is stigmatized rather than encouraged.
Right. Yeah, you would prefer to have a scientist who would be so embarrassed that a flaw was found in his or her research that they would immediately retract it and then follow up with a corrected study.
Yes.
Rather than just forging on as if nothing had happened.
Yeah, so maybe Donald Trump's not the only person in American public life who can't admit a mistake, right?
Right. Though at least these scientists are not quite so active on social media.
Yes. Not yet, at least. Despite these significant structural problems, I'm not ready to conclude that scientific research beggars belief. And here's why. The muckrakers, the defenders of scientific truth, are mobilizing fast, and they're shedding more and more light on the wrongdoers. There's a growing contingent of investigative reporters and independent researchers, many working for no pay to expose this kind of misconduct. I already mentioned the academic crowdsourcing site PubPeer and how it uncovered the flaws in Tessier-Levine's research. Francesca Gino's fabricated work was uncovered by Data Colada, a blog created by 3 behavioral scientists and focused on the reliability and integrity of social science research. In 2015, the Reproducibility Project repeated 100 published psychology experiments simply to see if they would yield the same results. It found that even though 97% of the studies originally reported statistically significant results, just 36% of the replications did. And then there's Retraction Watch, founded by 2 science journalists, which serves as a clearinghouse for reports about questionable research papers. Its motto is, quote, tracking retractions as a window into the scientific process, end quote. The retractions come from all parts of the scientific spectrum, from physical science, also known as hard science, to social science, soft science. Vaccines and autism, stem cells and human cloning, physics discoveries at Bell Labs, cancer in rats caused by herbicides, cognition research, and changing attitudes about gay marriage are just a handful of examples of the debunked scientific claims exposed by Retraction Watch. Many of the cases posted there come from tips from scientists, science journalists, and whistleblowers who share the blog's mission. The fields of anesthesiology and psychology lead the way in retractions, largely because of intrepid tipsters allied with this blog. Retraction Watch's records suggest that 2/3 of retractions come from actual misconduct or the suspicion of misconduct, while the other third comes from lab errors like tainted samples or statistical mistakes. A push by younger scientists for more transparency has led to the current hypervigilant climate in which a recent study in the journal Nature found a 10-fold increase in retraction notices over the preceding decade. To be fair, There are other reasons to explain the surge in retractions. Many more papers are published in many more journals than existed 20 years ago. Technology has led to the development of new detection tools like anti-plagiarism software. There's also a growing practice of providing preprints in which research can be discussed before it's published. It's possible that more retractions are mostly due to the combination of larger volume and better detection. But there's no doubt that the increased transparency brought by blogs like Retraction Watch have made it harder for bad actors to get away with misconduct.
Yeah.
There are also science researchers who've become fraud investigators and de facto public watchdogs by calling out their fellow scientists for the shoddiness of their studies. The Science website chronicles the work of two such debunkers, Nick Brown and James Heathers, who went public with their documented reservations about a study published by the French psychologist Nicolas Guégan that men are less likely to assist women who tie up their hair. Just pause for a second to let that land.
Yeah, this seems to speak more to the researcher's own points of view than...
Yes. This same guy has published studies saying that blonde women with big breasts get more attention. So that gives you a window into his focus of his life's work.
I already know more than I want to about this researcher.
Yes. According to Science, Guégan had, quote, a penchant for publishing titillating findings about human behavior, end quote. And Brown and Heathers suspected his latest finding was too ridiculous to be true, which it was. Their work was also instrumental in the retraction of some of Brian Wansink's papers in nutrition science. They've become so well known and highly regarded that many academics with suspicions about particular research go to them for help. In fact, Heathers wants to produce a scalable online course to spread the statistical review methods that he and Brown employ because he says, quote, peer review misses all the hard stuff and a worrying amount of the easy stuff, end quote.
Yeah. I'm hoping that you'll be speaking more about peer review because that is one of the leading questions here is like the whole point of peer review is to stop bad studies from getting published, and yet they just seem to be waving crap through. And I wonder what's behind that. Yeah,
we're going to get into the perverse incentives in a bit, so hold that thought. Dorothy Bishop, a professor of developmental neuropsychology at the University of Oxford, has an interesting idea for how to improve the quality of published research. Make researchers publicly pre-register their research plans. Says Bishop, quote, simply put, if you are required to specify in advance what your hypothesis is and how you plan to test it, then there is no wiggle room for cherry-picking the most eye-catching results after you have done the study, end quote. Afterwards, researchers can also upload their raw materials or code to open databases, which would make it easy for others to check their work. These ideas are slowly gaining traction in the scientific world. Of course, there are unethical people in all walks of life, so we shouldn't be surprised to find them in academic research. But maybe we're more likely to suspend our disbelief when those researchers are telling us things we intuitively believe to be true.
Sure.
For example, we know the food industrial complex is trying to get us to eat more with its supersized portions. So we're inclined to believe Brian Wansink's research that using a smaller soup bowl will lead to weight loss and well-being. But there's more than confirmation bias at play here. James Hamblin wrote a thought-provoking essay in The Atlantic about Wansink's fall from grace, and I want to quote it at length because I think it touches on something important. I quote, "It's easy to let down one's skepticism toward apparently virtuous work. Studies are manipulated and buried and disingenuously designed or executed all the time for commercial reasons, notoriously in domains like pharmaceuticals, where there is a clear incentive to prove that a product is safe and effective, that the years and millions of dollars that went into developing a drug were not wasted, and rather that they were in service of a safe and effective billion-dollar product. But a bulk of the inquiry into Wansink's research practices centered on a study about getting children to choose fruits and vegetables as snacks if they were marked with stickers bearing popular cartoon characters. Why would someone fabricate a study about how to get kids to eat more fruits and vegetables? End quote. That's thought-provoking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the answer, I think. There are realities at the top and the bottom of the lab research food chain that perversely incentivize people to do exactly that. At the top, among lab directors like Tessier, Levine, and Wansink, there's the competition to get noticed and then to stay in the public eye. And depending on the ambition and moral compass of the lab directors, that might lead to tolerating the cutting of corners or even authorizing the outright falsification of research.
Sure. In the case of Tessier Levine, it got him a university presidentship at a university of the stature of Stanford.
Yes.
So until that freshman got busy looking into the tip, things are working out pretty well for him. And all of
True.
it was built on the foundation of bad science.
Yes. And that's at the top. On the bottom, the postdocs who staff labs like those run by Tessier, Levine, and Wansink are desperate for publication credits so they can get the tenure track jobs that their lab directors already have. As the old saying goes, publish or perish.
Sure. Yeah.
Postdocs are notoriously overworked and underpaid, and it's easy to imagine them cutting corners and falsifying data with the express or implied consent of their employers.
Yeah. If you can imagine yourself working in one of these labs, putting in long hours running results, and you know that your only way out of that very marginal existence is by getting your name on enough studies as a co-author with this highly respected figure, then sure, there's a ton of incentive for you to get the results that will get your name on that published study.
Yes.
Because it is literally the key to your career.
Yep. Too often, when it comes to the dodgy work of researchers like Wansink and Tessier Levine, all the entities that should have been vetting their work all along, and I'm talking about the universities that fund them, the journals that do the peer review you just mentioned and that ultimately publish their studies, all those entities conveniently play dumb or turn a blind eye. They were more than willing to support studies engineered to generate buzz for their journals and funding for their universities, and to bask in the prestige afforded to work that breaks through to the cultural mainstream, as theirs did. Hamblin, writing in The Atlantic, isn't sure how, quote, to let people conduct experiments to answer questions in an environment as free as possible of any incentive that would bias that process, end quote. But he strongly suspects the answer involves more public funding of science and an infrastructure for the dissemination of scientific information that is not dependent on how many likes a study's findings receive on social media. As for me, Mark, call me a naive Pollyanna, but I'm not terribly worried. I think the growing ecosystem for pre- and post-publication vetting of scientific work is the answer to this problem. Whereas principal authors and journal editors often ignored anonymous or private requests for clarification or to provide underlying data, the online and very public presence of Retraction Watch, PubPeer, and other watchdogs has made it near impossible for the industry to bury its head in the sand. Their pressure also bolsters declining public trust in science by making the processes of correction and retraction more visible. The stakes here are significant. At a fraught time in our nation's history when the credibility of science has been under assault from the outside by climate change deniers, anti-vaccine skeptics, and other subspecies of flat earthers, it's especially important that scientific rigor and integrity not be undermined from the inside as well.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I'm not quite as hopeful as you are in terms of the grassroots verification process,
Yeah.
buttressing the public's perception of the scientific process. I think that might actually work to the opposite effect. If you imagine a Republican Party that is anti-science, as it largely is at this point, then one of their convenient targets could be the fact that the government funds a lot of this research through the National Science Foundation. Earlier, you referred to the universities as funding this research to some extent, yes, but largely it's also the taxpayer. And so when a study is retracted because some grassroots organization highlighted the bad science in there, that I could see easily becoming grist for the mill of an anti-science series of hearings in Congress where they're pulling university presidents and researchers in front of a committee and posing hard questions about how they're using taxpayer money, because they are literally using taxpayer money for this sort of thing. And I'm kind of a little bit surprised that it hasn't reached that point yet, because it's such a convenient target for the anti-intellectual crowd,
right,
which would play very well with the base of certain politicians who we already know. So far, we're lucky in that this has not become a cause of the right of going directly at science as the enemy.
Yes.
But it does seem like it's just kind of laying there as an opportunity for them.
Yeah, you make a good point. I hadn't considered the political implications of this, but I think your point is very sound. And maybe they just are not keyed into this yet. They haven't done any research into it, but it does seem like it's a cause célèbre waiting to happen, doesn't it? And I also want to acknowledge one weakness in my optimism, which is I strongly believe the grassroots infrastructure for vetting scientific papers is there and is going to be even there in a bigger way in years to come. But the time lag is still an issue. You know, as I pointed out in the examples I gave, sometimes it took 6, 7, 8 years before the good guys caught up with what the bad guys were doing. And in that time, they had received all these plum jobs, and their incorrect work had been cited hundreds, if not thousands of times in journals. So even though I feel like I'm on firm ground saying that the correction will it come fast enough? You know, that I'm not so sure about.
Yeah, the time lag is definitely a problem. I believe that some of these studies were 20 years old before light was finally shed on them. And so I would think that if there's a solution to the problem, it's not necessarily examining studies after the fact, but we also have to look at that original perverse incentive where academic researchers are incentivized to get results into print, even if they don't have the data for it.
Yes.
Even if they need to falsify the data in the hopes that no one's going to discover it, because so much rides on that. Tenure rides on that. Their salary rides on that. Their job security rides on that. And their future within the discipline rides on that.
Yes.
And so really, I feel like we're not going to be past this problem until academia has taken a hard look at itself and asked, what are we doing here? We are not in the business just to give people tenure and to promote the highly successful researchers. We're in the business of science, and we need to get back to that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you just said. I would just point out that my optimism is founded on the growing infrastructure I mentioned. But that wasn't the only solution I proposed at the end. The one that I ascribed to Dorothy Bishop about pre-registering your research plans. So if you're chasing down a particular hypothesis, but it doesn't prove to be true, you can find other cherry-picked data to come up with an even sexier hypothesis and then publish that. That's the status quo. But if you have to pre-register your research plans and your hypothesis gets blown out of the water, there is no cherry picking to be done. You know, I think that's a real fail safe. And it's just a matter of whether the research industrial complex has the institutional will to adopt a change like that, which would really make things better in a hurry.
Yeah, I agree. It would also be nice if we got better at celebrating failure.
Yes.
Because like you pointed out, failures Great.
Yes.
Any time that you have a hypothesis and you prove that it's not true, that is an advancement of the knowledge. And so we need to get out of the mindset that only positive results matter. Negative results are important too, and we should celebrate more failures than we do.
Yes, totally true. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm sure many books have been written about great scientists who set off to do one thing and ended up with an unbelievable discovery that had nothing to do with their original research aim. But we maybe don't have the same tolerance for that as we did before because of all the financial imperatives that you mentioned a minute ago.
Right. Yeah, penicillin was discovered because of laboratory failure.
Yeah.
A researcher failed to keep his samples clean.
There you go.
And they became infected with airborne yeasts, which then killed the bacteria in his samples. And boom, we have a discovery that saves millions of lives. And it was because that guy performed sloppy research and then followed up on what he saw.
Yes.
And good for that guy.
Yes. So I think I have a slightly more optimistic viewpoint than you do, but I think, would it be fair to say that you're not despairing about nearly half of science not being worth the paper it's printed on?
I haven't reached the point of despair yet. I am disappointed in a large number of scientists. I feel like they should hold themselves to a higher standard.
Yeah.
But I have not reached the point of despair yet.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have a question for you for next time.
Okay.
And usually we preface our questions to each other with a few sentences, teeing up the subject we're asking about, so the other guy has some context. You know, where am I coming from when I ask you this question? But this time, I'm not going to do that. This time, I thought it would be fun to give you my own answer to my question before I give you the question. You ready for this? Okay. Here's my answer. Here's Joe's answer to the question. No. N-O. No, 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 no. 1,000 times no. Over my dead body, no. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Now here's the question. Mark, if you had a son and he wanted to play football, would you let him?
Okay. The irony is that a large part of the answer depends on the position he plays, but we'll get into that in more detail in our next session.
You're teasing a little bit of your argument already. I like it. And I left it open for you to go wherever you want to go with it. I know where I would go with that question, but I didn't want to hold you to that and give you all this gobbledygook at the beginning that set parameters around you. So take it where you will. And I hope that's an interesting and fun question for you.
Yes, and I appreciate that I have an open field in front of me, that it's only green, and that I have an end zone to run towards by whichever path I choose.
That's right. Although when we tape this one in 2 weeks, I will be the tackler emerging and approaching you fast. So
Indeed.
But you have an open field right now.
Okay, so I will jump on that like a football player jumping on a fumble. Come back to you with a response. But in the meantime, we're done, because that is the conclusion of this episode. If what Joe had to say posed some questions in your mind, or if you have some comments to add, you can share those things on our Facebook page. That's at Mansplaining the Podcast. You can post questions and comments. You can check Joe's sources. You can do the reading that he did. You can even suggest an additional topic, and maybe we will follow up on it.
Yes.
If you're not a Facebook kind of person, but you do have a question for us, we have another means for you to reach out, and that is our Google Voice voicemail box, where you can leave a question, a suggestion for a future episode, or random comments on us as human beings. It's open to everything. And that number is 206-486-4074. Operators are standing by. If you would like to help us grow this audience, the best way you can do that is by leaving a rating and a review. You should do that on your podcast platform of choice. If you're an Apple person, go into Apple's podcasts. If you are an Android person, Google Play is the place to go. If, like Joe, you're a Spotify person, you can leave a rating there. Give it 5 stars if you feel like that's just. If you think it's worth 4 stars, then we would like to hear from you why you are selling us short in that way. We would feel a little betrayed, but we'd like to see, some insight into your point of view. You can leave those things on our voicemail box or on Facebook. But whatever you do, please leave reviews because it helps other people discover this podcast.
Yes.
If you're trying to think of other ways of getting the word out about this podcast, one thing to consider, just throwing this out there, is graffiti. Like just, freeway overpasses, right? Mansplaining. And let people try to figure it out. They'll be puzzled. They'll be intrigued. They'll explore what is this mansplaining the podcast, and they'll arrive here and they'll be thankful to you.
Yeah. Good idea.
Yeah. I'm just an idea man. I'm just the idea man here. But that's it for this week, and we are thankful that you spent some time with us. I'm Mark, that was Joe, and we'll see you next time.
Talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.